A few years ago, I was dating a man who at that time was in a seminary here in Philadelphia, and the particular seminary he attended, had they known that he was dating a man, would have expelled him. Not, of course, as we know, that meant that there weren't lots of LGBT people there. In fact, one of the stories I remember him telling me was about a professor of his whom he ran into in the neighborhood at one point, and when the professor saw him, quickly ran out of the establishment where they both were. But in any case, the two of us were out with another friend who was also at that same seminaries. We were all out socially on South Street, and we encountered a street preacher. Now, that's something else that our community is familiar with dealing with. I personally have interacted with Michael Markavage on a number of occasions. He's the man who runs Repent America, which used to be ubiquitous at our various public events. But this particular individual on South Street was using what I recognized as a script that had come from Kirk Cameron, another famously anti-LGBT individual. And although I don't recommend this as a general policy, there are situations in which I will engage a street preacher, I will engage a protester, if it's possible to actually have a real one-on-one conversation with that person. If the other person has a megaphone, there's no point, but if you can actually interact directly, in my experience, that can lead in much different and better directions. I previously mentioned Michael Markavage. I've been able to catch him without a megaphone and have real conversations with him enough that he literally runs away from me now when he sees me. You would think that someone like that, who makes a point out of being very public about his opposition, and in situations where he's very outnumbered, would actually be courageous or eloquent when gotten one-on-one, and he's entirely the reverse. He's neither courageous nor eloquent, and he doesn't run because I'm somehow physically intimidating or I have a megaphone. He runs because he's not actually capable of engaging in these conversations intelligently. Anyway, the street preacher on South Street. We went back and forth for a while and eventually came to an end, primarily because the other two people in the party really wanted to move on with their evening. They didn't want to hear me go on and on and on with this gentleman. But that's not where the story ends, and that's what I like about this story. I happened to be back on South Street the next day, and when he saw me, his face changed immediately, and he stopped what he was doing, and he came over to me, and again, I'm simply going to tell you what he said. What value you place on this is entirely up to you. I'm going to try to pull some points out of it later, but what he said was, "I'm so glad that you came back, because last night when I was alone in my room praying, God told me that I was wrong, that I shouldn't have assumed that you were not a Christian, that I shouldn't have assumed that I was right and you weren't. And I prayed that you would come back so that we could have this conversation." Now, again, you don't need to believe any of the sort of mystical parts of this, but it does demonstrate two things which I think are crucially important. The first one is related to the title of this evening and the fact that we mention marriage. It is true, of course, that marriage does not mean that everything that our community needs has suddenly, miraculously, at once been accomplished. But I really think that it is important to remember that the reason we won the legal argument is that we won the moral argument first. When the first LGBT rights marches were held a couple of blocks from here, 50 years ago, it was received wisdom, as has been discussed eloquently already tonight, that somehow we are, as the Roman Catholic Church would still say, intrinsically disordered. and that was just assumed to be true. But as we came out, and as people saw who we were, the golden rule started to operate. People realized that we should be treated as they would want to be treated. And that fundamentally moral argument actually overcame the supposedly moral arguments that were coming from people who had institutional authority that said that they were moral leaders, that they were religious leaders, and that they were spiritual leaders. And I think that as we move forward, we need to lean into the fact that we did win that moral argument, that we have the insight and the experience to be able to say to someone who makes a claim like that, you need to listen to me because I'm a moral leader, I'm a spiritual leader, I'm a religious leader. Like, the power of that is not the institution that backs you. The power of that is not your fan base. The power of it is whether or not it's actually true, whether or not you're actually making a reasonable moral argument. And I think that that point can continue to propel us forward for the battles that we continue to need to wage. And the second point is this. One of the most bizarre things about the story that I told is its sort of mystical spirituality in the context of a kind of conservatism. There are LGBT people in every conceivable religious tradition. I don't need to be a Roman Catholic, I don't need to be a Muslim, I don't need to be a Hindu to understand that an LGBT person who also has a commitment to one of those religious traditions is going to be able to make the moral argument within that particular religious tradition better than I can. So, although on the one hand, we have to be honest about recognizing that much of the opposition to our civil rights does come from religious sources, we also need to be generous to the members of our community who also have varied religious commitments, because by being LGBT in those different religious communities, they are doing work that we can't do because we're not also part of those communities.